How's it going, you guys? So this is the part 2 video of evidence for evolution. If you haven't checked out part 1, go check that out now. But in part 1, we discussed evidence that we could use to show evolution, to demonstrate evolution. Hardy-Weinberg evidence, mathematical evidence, and data can be used to justify or support evolution. Biogeography, evidence from paleontology, the study of fossils, those were all things we discussed in the last video. In this video, I want to talk about evidence from other fields, such as anatomy or comparative anatomy, the study of bodily structures, developmental biology, the study of embryos developing, fetuses developing, that kind of stuff, and then molecular biology, molecular biology / genetics, the study of genes, the study of gene expression, that kind of stuff. So all of these things we will touch upon, so let's get started with anatomy. So over here I have some drawings that I want to discuss. So if you guys take anatomy or anatomy and physiology here at St. John's, you will know well that anatomy is the study of bodily structures, right? So the study of bones, the study of blood vessels, that kind of stuff. But we could also use anatomy for other organisms besides humans. We could talk about the anatomy of a fish, the anatomy of an octopus, the anatomy of a tree even. So anatomy is something that isn't just for humans. And so there's a field called comparative anatomy. You could actually maybe take this as a class in college. But comparative anatomy compares the structures within one organism, one species, with the structures of another. And what we see when we compare anatomies of different species is homologous structures. So homologous structures serve as evidence for evolution. Homologous structures are basically when an organism of two organisms of different species have the same underlying structure, but they might serve different functions. So for instance, if we looked at the limbs of, let's say, a human, you would see that in the upper arm, there is a single bone. Then in the lower arm, the forearm, you see two bones. So the first one is the humerus, the second two are the ulna and radius, and then you see many bones in the hands. We see the carpals, the metacarpals, the phalanges. So we'll just say many bones to make it simple. So in humans, we have the one bone, two bones, many bones pattern. Now this is not just for humans. If we look at a different species, let's say a cat. If we look at a cat or a dog or any four-limbed animal, you would see that they have a one bone in their upper leg, two bones in their lower leg, and then many bones in their paws, right? So we still see the one bones, two bones, many bones pattern. In whales are very different in structure and function than, let's say, a human. However, if you look at their fins, you still see an underlying pattern of one bone, two bones, many bones, which is different than many fish, for instance. Many fish do not have bones within their fins that match this pattern, at least. So whales follow this one bone, two bones, many bones pattern. If we look at bats, bats follow this one bone, two bones, many bones pattern, right? And just to compare them, humans use their arms to grab things, to pick things up, maybe to hit things, I don't know. But cats use their legs for running, right? Whereas a whale uses its fins for swimming, and a bat uses its arms for flying, right? So each of these organisms have sort of changed their the function of this one bone, two bones, many bones basic pattern to meet their needs over evolutionary time. But that being said, we still see that same underlying pattern. And the only explanation for this same underlying pattern is the fact that they all shared a common ancestor that had that pattern. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense why whales might have this one bone, two bones, many bones pattern, would have finger bones when they don't necessarily have fingers. So that serves as evidence for evolution and common ancestry. Other pieces of evidence from comparative anatomy come with other types of structures that you should know about. Vestigial structures, for instance. Vestigial structures are structures that at one time served a purpose in our ancestors, but no longer do. So for instance, if you look at whales and if you look at their skeletal structures, you would actually see that they have these very small hind limb or back limb bones. Now, you might be familiar with the general shape of a whale. You might understand that you can't see any actual back legs because back legs don't really serve a purpose for whales. But regardless, those bones, those hind limb bones are still there. Now the question is, why are they there? The only explanation is that those hind limb bones were found in a common or a previous ancestor that used the hind limb bones, but over evolutionary time, they've become smaller and smaller because the whales have developed to live more and more in water. So if you look at the history of the fossil record of whales, you actually see that going back in time, their hind limb bones become more and more prevalent, and organisms that once walked on land, almost like wolf-like organisms, they were what whales derived from. So the fact that whales have hind limb bones, vestigial structures that they don't need, but they still have, serves as evidence for evolution. And there are plenty of vestigial structures to talk about. We ourselves have many. We have a tailbone called a coccyx. It's very small, but it's still part of our vertebrae, or it's continuous with our vertebrae. And do we need it? No. Do we have a tail? Not typically, unless an error comes up during development that causes us to still develop a slight small tail. But regardless, we still have some form of a tail. And that's because our ancestors, the only explanation is that our ancestors had a tail, and over evolutionary time, we've kind of adapted to not have a tail anymore, or at least a functional tail. The human appendix as well. The human appendix is something that's full of bacteria. It's supposed to help us break down greens and vegetables and stuff like that, because we are not exclusively herbivores anymore, at least, since we do eat meat and we eat other things. We have adapted to not really need the appendix as much, but if you look at something like a cow has evolved to definitely have a giant appendix-like structure that helps it break down all the grass that it eats. So the human appendix and tailbone both are examples of vestigial structures that we no longer really need. We can get our appendix removed if it causes us problems, but we still have it because it's a vestigial structure. Analogous structures also serve as evidence for convergent evolution, when organisms of different species end up developing a similar trait, but maybe it has different origins. So for instance, flight and wings have developed in a couple different ways because it's evolutionarily advantageous. So for instance, the wings of a bat might be different than the wings of, let's say, an insect. Wings of a bat have developed as membranes from the bat's arm, right? Whereas if you look at an insect, it doesn't have arm bones or anything like that, but it's developed wings on its back. So those are examples of analogous structures that have developed out of evolutionary benefit, I guess you could say. But all of those fall under comparative anatomy and show evidence for evolution. But I also want to talk about developmental biology, a separate class that shows, or a separate subfield that shows evidence for evolution. As you can see, I've drawn up a couple of different embryos from different organisms. This right here is an embryo from a developing fish. This is an embryo of a developing reptile, an embryo of a developing bird, and an embryo of a developing human. Now, if you were to just look at a picture of some embryo, chances are, unless you are an expert, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the embryo of, let's say, a reptile versus the embryo of a human, right? And it's interesting because the embryos all develop the same, and they might even develop similar characteristics that don't continue with them all the way up until the end of development. So, for instance, let's look at the fish. The fish, it probably comes as no surprise that a fish develops with gills, right? So it starts developing gill slits. It also develops a tail, which it uses for swimming. Makes sense, it's a fish. But if you look at a reptile, reptiles, as you know, do not have gills, right? They oftentimes don't breathe underwater. However, that being said, reptiles still develop with gill slits early in development, and then those gill slits end up developing into something else. It still develops a tail, and many reptiles keep their tail all the way through the end of development, so that's no surprise, but this gill slit might come as a surprise to you. Birds also develop gill slits early in development, and as you know, birds don't breathe underwater. You might have some aquatic type birds, but they don't have gills. They're not going to be breathing underwater. So the fact that they develop gills is kind of odd. They do develop tails. Birds have tails. That makes sense. But humans don't have a tail, or don't have a functional tail. They have the vestigial structure of a tailbone, right? But they start developing with tails, and they start developing with gills. As you know, being a human, gills don't breathe, or humans do not breathe underwater. So having gills, starting to develop with gills, makes no sense. But if you consider it in the context of evolution, and the fact that we've all had a common ancestor and we've diverged, it makes sense that we might start developing with gills, but because our developmental pattern has changed over the years, this gills, what starts off as early gills, develops into parts of the jaw structure, right? So really, the fact that we have such similar embryos across species provides further evidence that we are all related, right? That we all have some sort of common ancestry. And for this shows common ancestry with fish, early ancestral fish relatives. So let's talk about our last category, our last subfield of biology that shows evidence for evolution, and that's molecular biology. Molecular biology / molecular genetics, right? So we discussed this already in a past unit. We talked about the central dogma of biology, the central dogma of genetics, and that's the fact that DNA gets transcribed as RNA and ultimately translated as protein. Now that protein could be an enzyme, whatever, it could be a structural protein, but it goes off to do some function. And DNA needs to be able to replicate through DNA replication so that the DNA can be passed to the next cell when cells divide, so that the DNA can be passed to future generations, right? So this is something we already know. So it's interesting that this process is conserved, is largely the same in all living organisms, whether you're a fly, whether you're a human, or a fly cell or a human cell, whether you are a bacterial cell even, something that's pretty far removed from humans, this process is still the same, which shows, or which provides evidence towards the fact that we are all connected, right? We all share a common ancestry. And this is conserved in all species. DNA is the genetic code for all things that we consider to be alive. Some viruses use RNA as opposed to DNA, but we don't generally consider viruses to be alive. Ribosomes are found in all living organisms, prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells, and also the way it's read, the fact that it's read in triplets, right? We talked about how codons, these triplet base groups for RNA, get translated into amino acids for proteins. So this general process is conserved in all organisms, and that provides evidence that we are all connected, right? We all share a common ancestry, or ancestor that had these general features, right? And that have changed only slightly over time. I also want to mention similarities in DNA sequences. Now, before I get into that, I want to refresh your memory on how inheritance works. So if you have, let's say, a general DNA sequence with one generation of great-great-grandparents, let's just say, or great-grandparents, that sequence might look something like this, right? ACC, GTAC, ACGT, That could be a part of their sequence. Now, when they pass that to the next generation, that sequence may not change. Maybe it stays the same. Maybe we still have the ACCG, blah, 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 blah. But in the next generation, it's possible that a mutation could arise. Mutations arise all the time, right? Through errors in DNA replication. DNA replication is pretty efficient, but every now and again an error does arise, leading to a mutation. So we might see, instead of a C here, that might have been replaced with a T. But besides that, everything else is the same, right? And now if we go to the next generation, maybe another mutation arises, where we have a small change here, and now it's slightly different than the great-great-grandparents, or just great-grandparents, right? So in this case, this kind of shows, we already discussed how inheritance of DNA works, and how mutations can arise and change the DNA for the next generation. And this very well could be different between siblings, right? One sibling could have one mutation while the other sibling doesn't. So that's how general inheritance works. And generally speaking, your DNA should resemble, for like 99.99999% of your DNA, should resemble that of your parents. It should be very similar to that of a sibling, a close sibling, like a brother or sister. But maybe it's slightly different than that of a cousin, right? But cousins, because we guys share the same grandparents, still should have very similar DNA. And it turns out that 99.9999999% or something like that, something super, super close, you have the same DNA as, say, a cousin, right? Very similar to DNA. So if you take this understanding of how DNA and inheritance works, and then you look at it in the context of different species have very similar DNA strands. Now, it might not be as similar as, say, a brother or sister, or even a cousin, or even a far distant cousin, but still, the similarities are pretty remarkable. If you look at human DNA sequences, compare that to chimpanzee DNA sequences, they're about 98.8% similar. If you compare that to something else a little more distant, chimpanzees are considered our closest living relative. Let's compare that to mice. Mice we share 90% of our DNA sequence with. If we compare it to dogs we share about 84% of our sequence with. And these are all mammals, so it makes sense that we share a good amount of our DNA, but even if we compare it to things that aren't mammals, things that are, let's say, a bird, we have chickens. Chickens we share 65% of our DNA sequence with. And you would think that we are not even closely related to chickens, but our DNA says otherwise. So all in all, our DNA similarities, when it comes to molecular biology, we still see homologies, right? Homologies don't just exist in our bones. We see homologies in our DNA. We see gene homologs, which are genes that serve a similar purpose but are used for different organisms. Researchers use these all the time because there are ethical issues with experimenting on humans, but if you do gene experiments on something like a yeast cell, and that yeast cell has a gene that's very similar to human genes because of evolution and our common ancestry, we could do experiments on this yeast gene, and then once we have learned what we need to learn, then we start applying it to humans, or progressively closer organisms until we get to humans. So we have gene homologies. We have protein homologies, histone proteins. If you compare different organisms and their histone proteins, they're largely the same. Maybe a few of their amino acids have been switched out for others because of mutations that have caused slight divergences. But ultimately, it's very, very similar, which is something you would expect if there was common ancestry. So all in all of these pieces of evidence from different subfields of biology all connect to evolution. Hopefully we'll be able to do a blast experiment this year where we are comparing the DNA sequences of different species and we see homologies and how similar their DNA sequences are, but we'll have to wait and see. But anyway, that is the Evidence for Evolution Part 2 video, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the